We live in a fantasy world now. Reality has been destroyed.
This is the time that we really need to pay attention.
The probabilities are overwhelmingly on gold's side.
That is the best environment to see gold increase its value.
Welcome to Palisade's Gold Radio. I'm your host, Tom Bodrovics. Joining me today is Kevin Freeman. Kevin is a co-founder of the NSIC, host of the Economic War Room, a New York Times bestselling author, and considered one of the world's leading experts on the issues of economic warfare. Kevin, thanks so much for joining me today.
Oh, Tom, it's an honor to be with you.
I have to start by thanking Gary for the introduction to you. You know, I've been looking forward to this conversation because you have such an eloquent way of communicating these ideas. So why don't we start with explaining what pirate money is to you and why this is an important subject for you to communicate to your audience?
Sure. Well, pirate money is basically what I've committed my career to recently. Pirate money, when you think pirate money, you think of gold doubloons and pieces of eight, which is, Captain Jack Sparrow or Blackbeard or Long John Silver, something like that. But essentially what it is gold and silver. It is what has been historically money from the time of Genesis and written in the Bible, all the way through the book of Revelation. It's what secular societies, religious societies, everybody recognized gold and silver as money until fairly recently, when we've kind of gotten away from that. Now we treat them as commodities or we treat them as investments, but really gold and silver are money. And our founders of the United States back in 1776 and 1787, when they were writing and creating our Constitution, the Declaration of Independence, and so forth, they were wanting to escape the British. And escaping the British meant not using pounds or farthings or shillings, so they used Spanish money, a Spanish milled dollar, also known as a piece of eight, and a gold doubloon. Well, when you talk about real money in those terms, people think pirate money. My passion is to take the world back to a sound money system. With this inflated money that we have, the fiat currencies that we have around the world, we're heading towards a debt crisis that's going to wipe out the middle class, wipe out the poor, and just give opportunities for the elites to enrich themselves. I'm against that. I want to see average, normal people prospering and succeeding because they have sound money.
Absolutely. I mean, those sentiments, I think, are the most important, but it also takes time and it takes education to be able to understand that, because there's so many of these pieces of our currency, of our money, of really the fabric of our society as it underpins our value system in that way, that have been subverted. And really, I think a lot of distraction or, techniques have been used to really obfuscate these ideas. But I want to get one more definition before we go on here. How do you also define economic warfare?
Okay, so economic warfare has been something that we've seen in civilization since the Peloponnesian Wars, whether it's a blockade, and you say, we're going to deny a country having access to a rare earth mineral or energy or food. That's an economic means to conduct warfare. It's not kinetic. It's not like pulling a gun and shooting somebody or lobbing a cruise missile at them. But it is an important part of warfare. It's a part of how the Cold War was won. Reagan essentially created economic conditions for the Soviet Union that made it untenable. Crashing the price of oil, working with the Saudis, working with Margaret Thatcher, working with the Pope, at the same time ramping up defense spending. He literally starved the Soviet Union of hard money capital, and at the same time made it impossible for them to keep up with the American defense buildup. That's economic warfare. It's been a part, in fact, in the United States, we had a Bureau of Economic Warfare during the World War II under Franklin Delano Roosevelt. The Germans were printing currency, counterfeiting British currency. That's economic warfare. Anything that you use to undermine your adversary or your enemy with economic means would be titled economic warfare. It's a lost art, but it's an important one.
Can we really, think about the idea that these agencies or these strategies don't exist in the West anymore?
Oh, they absolutely exist in the West, But in terms in the United States, what we do repeatedly is use offensive economic warfare with this arrogant assumption that it will never be used back against us. We've used them, for example, economic warfare against Russia. When they invaded the Ukraine, we applied sanctions, we took money, the capital that Russians had in US banks and depositories and so forth. But what we didn't know is, number one, Putin was aware that we would do this and prepared for it, and thus the Russian economy is not hammered like we would have expected. And number two, they have the ability to shoot back. And so the BRICS nations forming an alliance against the US dollar hegemony and the idea of removing it as the reserve currency is a shoot back. So what we've lost not is the offensive capability. We're just so arrogant here in America that we just assume that the US is always going to be dominant. The dollar will always be the currency of the world, and we act on that basis. Net result, Elon Musk was very clear. He says, if you weaponize your currency enough times, other nations will stop using it. That's what we're facing today. That's where we've lost the understanding.
Mm-hmm. So when we combine these, let's say these techniques of economic warfare with the idea that those in government are enriching themselves, has this really led us to the problems that we're now facing?
Oh, I don't think there's any question about it. We have foreign enemies and domestic enemies. The foreign enemies could be the Chinese Communist Party that wants to dominate the world. The domestic enemies are those that want to enrich themselves and literally, in some cases, enslave most people economically. I was talking to former Congressman Allen West. Allen West is, he basically said socialism is nothing other than a form of economic slavery. And the idea that the elites, if you go to George Orwell in 1984 or Animal Farm, the elites want to control everybody and everything. In Animal Farm, it was the pigs, and they said all animals are equal, except some animals are more equal than others. And that concept is what the elites, I wrote a book titled, According to Plan, The Elite's Secret Plan to Sabotage America. Their intention is literally to enslave us economically, whether it's with a central bank digital currency or whether it is just government policies, spending programs and so forth, the war on poverty and otherwise, to make us dependent and put them at the top of the heap.
In some ways, Kevin, do you see the debt-based monetary system as a form of this enslavement? Because, in an inflationary system, you just constantly have to keep running this treadmill in a way. You have to buy a car to go to work to do the thing, and it just never ends, right?
Yeah, it's a great point, Tom. I was watching 1883, the precursor to Yellowstone, and Harrison Ford and his team went into town, and they were showing them these brand new machines called washing machines and stuff. So in 1883, and they said, "Hey, guess what? If you buy this, it's gonna save you all this time and make life so much simpler for you." And how do I pay for it? Well, you pay for the electricity that you use to run these machines. He said, so I never own it. I'm just always renting it. And I said, oh, well, yes. Well, that's the whole World Economic Forum concept. You will own nothing and you'll be happy with it. No, the whole notion is we rent everything. This modern idea means that we're enslaved and we're working like in the old concept, you're working for the company store. You never get ahead. You never get outside of it. Only the very few elite turned out to be actual owners. The rest of us are renters. Mm-hmm. That's just literally a medieval system. We're serfs and they're the landowners.
Mm-hmm. So there are 5 truths that America is facing right now. Can you explain these to us and show us really how these all fit into your framework and how people need to be thinking about these ideas to get a better understanding of what is happening with our currency, our value, and our time?
Yeah, so let me explain first, is I don't think it's some grand conspiracy that's causing all of these. I think it's a combination of small conspiracies, people looking out at their own self-interest, and expediency and ignorance. And when you put them all together, it's created these 5 undeniable truths that we're facing. And these truths are a serious threat to the way we do business, our economy, our way of life. Threat number 1, undeniable truth, is our debt path is unsustainable. In the United States, it's $35 trillion. When I wrote this book, Pirate Money, which was published a year ago, August 1st of last year, 2023, I put a chart in there from usdebtclock.org, and I think our debt was $32.1 trillion, federal debt. It's $35 trillion today. It's gone up almost $3 trillion in 1 year. We're adding $1 trillion of debt, every 90 to 120 days here in the United States. And that is unsustainable because the interest alone on that is creating new debt. We're barely taking the tax revenues in to cover Social Security and Medicare, let alone defense and all the other programs that we have of the federal government. So it's unsustainable. And it's not just me saying that. It's Federal Reserve Chairman Jerome Powell says, on 60 Minutes, yes, our debt path is unsustainable. The Office of Management and Budget says, yes, over the next 30 years, we're going to add $100 trillion in new debt. Even in the next 10 years, before 2030, we're going to be $54 trillion in debt, according to Office of Management and Budget estimates. Bottom line is we are on this. It's like you got a teaser credit card rate for your family and you went and you maxed it out, but it was 0% interest. And then all of a sudden the teaser period's over. Now you're paying 8%, 10%, 12% interest. Guess what? You're now hooked and you're caught and you're in a trap and it is unsustainable. You can't continue on as you've done before. So that's number one. Number two is other nations see this. We've weaponized the currency of the US dollar and they want to push back. And so they're targeting our currency.
Sorry, Kevin. I was just wondering if we could go through, a couple of the nuances of the unsustainability of the debt path before we continue to number two. So
absolutely.
Let's go through what the interest alone is on the debt right now and how that, at these interest rates really accelerates this problem.
Okay, so we're getting a misleading picture that's dire in itself. I think the current interest for the fiscal year for the U.S. government is under $700 billion. And that's pretty bad on its own, but it's misleading because it's based on older interest rates where there was debt acquired 3, 4, 5 years ago at near zero rates that's rolling off. Mm-hmm. The actual fair market value of the interest today, the Treasury curve of the United States is between 4 and 5%. Doesn't matter if you're 30 days or 30 years, it's between 4 and 5%. On $35 trillion, 5% is $1.75 trillion. 4% on 35 trillion would be what? $1.4 trillion. So we have this misleading view that it's only $700 billion a year, but in reality, it's between 1.4 and 1.75 trillion, which is roughly half of all the personal income tax receipts of the entire United States population. That's how serious it is. And of course, in my lifetime, I remember the 1980s where the federal government was having to pay 10% interest rates. And that's something we might see again, given our debt situation. So that is why it's so unsustainable. Just interest alone. Forget the fact that Medicare is going to go up because the baby boom population is retiring. Social Security people will not be putting into it. They'll be taking out more than they're putting in, and Social Security is going to run out of money and have to be funded out of the U.S. Treasury. Put those things aside, we're in an unsustainable debt path.
Mm-hmm. Is there not a little bit of nuance to understand there as well, Kevin, with, let's say, the time structure of that debt? Like it's not like, all of a sudden when interest rates go up, the entirety of our debt ends up being at those new rates. We have to refi and roll that debt over, and that's when it becomes payable at that higher rate, right?
Yes, absolutely. Okay. And unfortunately, we had an opportunity, both Trump and Biden early in his term had opportunities to try and push to sell longer dated debt. They could have put 30-year debt out there. They could have put 50-year or 100-year debt at near zero interest rates. They chose, for political expediency, to go as short as possible to get the lowest rate possible. And the net result of it is we've got two-year, 5-year debt that should have been 30 or 50-year debt. that will roll off in coming months and years. So that we're going to have a dramatic increase in our, even if interest rates went down from here and the Fed lowered rates, we will be paying more in interest a year from now and 2 years from now than we're paying now, simply because that short duration debt's rolled off and it's being replaced at much higher rates.
Is part of that, responsibility also due or should be put on the shoulders of the Treasury Secretary to make those decisions of what type of debt we're issuing or what time period of debt we're issuing?
Absolutely. It is the entire administration should have been screaming this. Any economist, any thinking person would have said, if you can get 0 to 2% interest, go as long out as you possibly can. And that's just economic truth. When Citibank sends me an offer, they'll send me an offer. Well, now it's for 8%. You can get as low as 8% interest, and it will roll to 24%. But 3 years ago, it was 0% for 6 months, or it was 1.5% for 3 years. Well, if I were going to borrow, I would have taken the 1.5% for 3 years. I would go as long out as I possibly could. And if they'd offered me 1.5% for 50 years, I'd have taken that. And I'm in my 60s. But you grab it when you can. And I did the same thing when I refinanced my mortgage. You want as low a rate as you can and go as far out as you can.
So, exactly as you're saying that, you're explaining that they don't really understand this. Like, why does the government not really understand the structure of our debt while other nations actually do?
Well, I give you an example. There's a clip. If you can find it, I would throw it in there. Jared Bernstein, have you seen it? He was being interviewed. And
he has no idea how money is issued.
A very simple question. Why is it that we borrow money when we print money? Which is a fair question if you don't understand the Federal Reserve. If we're printing money, why do we borrow it? So the Fed creates money. They don't literally. The Treasury Department of the United States prints money at a printing facility in Fort Worth, Texas. I've been there. I've seen it. They print the bills. Most of our money is digitally created. It's not printed. And the Federal Reserve just magically creates it, and then they use it to buy U.S. Treasury bonds. And that's how money gets into the system. And then we have to pay interest on that. So he was asked that, but he had no idea. And he is the #1 chairman of the Council on Economic Advisors for President Biden. For 8 years, he was the top economist for Vice President Biden. And he doesn't get it at all.
So, Kevin, as we've been talking about just the interest on the debt, taking up, what did you say? It was 2/3 of all the tax receipts in the States?
Right now, interest on the debt's about 600 to 700 billion, and the tax receipts are about 3 trillion. The personal, not corporate tax, personal tax receipts are about 3 trillion. So right now, it's 20 to 25%. But it will soon be when the natural interest rate being 4 to 5% on the Treasury curve, meaning we're going to gravitate towards that over the next coming months. I think the average time left on the bonds that we hold is a year or less. So over the next year or so, we're going to be at 1.4 trillion to 1.75 trillion, which is half of all the tax receipts for interest only. Well, we're already running a $2+ trillion a year deficit. So anything added to that, any increase in that is just going to come with new debt, which we're going to borrow just to pay interest. When you're there, you're technically bankrupt.
Well, that's exactly where I wanted to go is, we're not only paying interest on the debt, but we also have these entitlement programs, defense spending. We have a budget that way exceeds our income in a way as a nation, right?
Oh, yes. And most of that is debt or spending that you can't control. Congress would have to touch Social Security or Medicare or entitlement programs. They're not willing or able to do that really politically. If you floated out there that either side, Trump, Biden, Kennedy, intended to cut Social Security, they're dead as candidates. They absolutely couldn't. So politically, we can't touch those. The amount of spending that we have that we can touch isn't sufficient to put us into a positive budget situation. So even if we cut every job, we closed every office, we fired everybody, we shut down the Defense Department, had no military spending, you do all of that and you still don't have a balanced budget.
So let's move on to the second truth, Kevin. Other nations are targeting our currency.
Yeah, so we've been using our currency as a weapon. It's something I warned about in the Pentagon in 2008. Hey, let's not do this. Let's think of economic warfare not just as we're the only ones with a gun, but other nations have guns too. Let's not just go after them. And in fact, every time we use this, we're lighting ourselves up as a target. So don't do that. We've done it. We've done it repeatedly. That's the answer to everything because it is a bloodless war in a sense. And so we've gone after other nations. We've cut them off from the SWIFT transaction system. So what do Russia and China do? They build their alternative. We've said the US dollar is the reserve currency of the world, so you have to hold US dollars, and if we want to, we'll cut you off from use of the dollar. Other nations have then responded by saying, hey, Saudi Arabia, why don't you take our currency for oil and not just US dollars? And the petrodollars come under threat. The net result of it is Brazil, Russia, India, and China formed a pact back in the early 2000s. At the behest of Vladimir Putin, they brought together nations that didn't really have anything natural in common. I mean, Russia and China, yes, potentially, but China and India? No, China and India are at each other's throats. They're not fond of each other. And how does Brazil fit in? But what they did was they said, let's create a trading bloc among us because their GDP combined was substantial. They were growth engines. They came with Putin's intention of removing the dollar as the reserve currency of the world. Goldman Sachs saw this and said, hey, that's a great investment opportunity. BRIC nations will make it like FANG stocks, which is Facebook, Amazon, Apple, Netflix, and Google. We'll make this the new investment theme, and it became an emerging market investment theme. But in reality, Putin intended it from the very beginning to remove the dollar's reserve currency. And it's picked up steam over time as we've continued to weaponize our currency. And so now there's like 90 nations that have shown interest in joining this BRICS alliance. They got South Africa, they've added Saudi Arabia and other nations. They have publicly stated that their goal is to remove the dollar as the reserve currency of the world. Why should we be completely dependent? And Putin's argument is a really strong one, I have to admit. He goes to India and Modi says, America's our friend. They would never hurt us. We have nothing against America. And he says, in World War II, can you tell me who America's enemies were? Oh, Germany and Japan, now American allies. And who were American allies in World War II? The Soviet Union and China. He said, things change. What happens, Modi, when the United States government doesn't like your internal policy over XYZ? So bottom line, American politics have seeped internationally. We've tried to force our politics on other nations. The net result of that is they say, you can't have that weapon aimed at us. We're going to go away from the United States dollar, either belligerently, where we hurt the currency, or maybe just hey, we don't want that controlling our destiny any longer, and they just want to get off. And he made a really good point. In 2008, the financial crisis started here in the United States, and yet the U.S. Treasury bond became the strongest instrument in the world. People started rushing into Treasury bonds, and Putin looks at that and says, how come your interest rates are going down and your financial position is getting stronger when you created and caused this financial crisis? Other nations have paid notice, so they are targeting our currency to remove it as the world's reserve currency.
Mm-hmm. Kevin, do you think that in some ways this is justified by the rest of the world because, as you brought up earlier, we seized Russia's assets, $300 billion in Russian assets, I believe. Was it billion or million at the beginning of the Ukraine war? We've been using the dollar as a weapon against these countries, and these countries want to, be able to trade, as you say. This seems like a justifiable action for the rest of the world.
Well, it also seems like a benign, inevitable action for the rest of the world. Why should the Brazilians who want to buy goods from China have to first translate their currency into US dollars when they could either use their currency or they could use Chinese yuan? I get that. It is a vestige of the old Bretton Woods system. Now, am I a strong dollar guy? Yes. But when we make the argument that if you trust the US dollar, we've got to say that's your money, and even in a war, we pay interest. Even in a war, and that way it becomes unimpeachable. We have not done that. They have a valid point. I want the dollar to be the strongest currency in the world. I absolutely do. I just wish we hadn't weaponized it as a means of economic warfare to the extent that we have. Or if we had, we used it as a nuclear weapon that you don't drop those very often. You use them very, very rarely because the repercussions are too great.
Yeah, I mean, I couldn't agree more. It seems like we have just abused the position that the dollar has created in the world. And, even just sitting back and looking at this for the amount of money that, let's say, is being sent to Ukraine, it just seems like such an abuse of power that is based on this currency that, is used to achieve whatever goal we want all around the world.
Just think of the irony of it in that we're borrowing money from the rest of the world and then we're using it as a weapon. When you put the debt path combined with the fact that we've weaponized our currency together, so we're going to borrow money from Russia and China and then we're going to use it to send to Ukraine to fight Russia. It doesn't make a whole lot of sense, but that's the weird world that we're in. But then when you throw on top of that a willingness to use the currency that we've borrowed from other people, it really creates a bizarre situation, and it makes it understandable that other nations are targeting our currency. But that doesn't change the fact that they're targeting our currency, and if they remove the dollar as reserve currency of the world. Let me take you back to the 1950s. Dwight D. Eisenhower is president. The great war hero general is president in the 1950s, and Eisenhower notices that the French and the British want to take the Suez Canal back from Nasser and the Egyptians. It was built by the French. It was managed by the British. It was nationalized by Nasser. And so they say, hey, you can't do that. They form armies and they're planning to go take it. And Eisenhower calls up the British and says, hey, if you do that, we own a lot of British debt. We'll just dump it on the market and bankrupt you. Wait, what? Yeah, our ally, we're going to do this. So we used their debt against them to achieve our foreign policy because we didn't want Nasser to fall into the Soviet orbit. Well, that's a really unusual historical thing, but the Chinese look at that and say, hey, we've loaned some money to America. Maybe we should dump American bonds to get them to do what we want them to do. So this isn't without precedent. But it is still a threat to the average American. If we lose the reserve currency of the world, what's that going to do? It's going to mean all our imports. Go to your local Walmart and see how many things are made in China and realize if the dollar's not the reserve currency of the world, how much more expensive will those items be? How much more expensive will the gas at the gas pump be? How much more expensive will the food that we get from Latin America be? We live in a globalized world and we've lived at the exorbitant privilege of having the reserve currency. Have we abused it? Yes, but it still will be painful if they cut us off.
Absolutely. So let's move on to the third truth, Kevin. Inflation creates a wealth gap that hurts the poor and will lead to destabilization.
Okay, so in 1971, when Nixon left the gold standard, it was August 1971, so we're looking at, 53 years ago, you could buy a Hershey candy bar for a dime. In fact, everything I wanted to do as a kid on a Saturday, I could earn $1.60. That's how much my dad would pay me to cut the front lawn. $1.60 an hour was the minimum wage in 1971. With that $1.60, I took 20 cents off and gave to my church as a tithe. And then I spent 10 cents for a Hershey bar. Under $1, I could get a cheeseburger, fries, and a shake at McDonald's. I bought a Spider-Man comic and I bought a Slurpee. I had my perfect Saturday. If you bought all those things today, it would cost closer to $20. Then it was $1.60. So inflation has gone up dramatically. In fact, according to the Consumer Price Index, which is the measure that we use of inflation, which I think understates inflation by a dramatic amount, but let's just use official government statistics, the dollar has lost 90% of its purchasing power since 1971. Now, if I'm wealthy, I can invest in things that benefit from inflation. And so as a result, I've kept not only my purchasing power, but I've actually grown in my wealth. And so the rich have gotten richer. All the studies and statistics have shown that since 1971. The average person, we've seen the economy financialized, which means that bottom line in America, we're not producing things, so the worker's being hurt. Inflation is hurting the consumer, but the wealthy people are able to invest in cheap labor countries and buy and produce goods at cheaper prices, and then they're profiting from that. America, we produce money. We produce stock market wealth. We financialize the economy. Now, the last time that this was done in a really dramatic fashion, not the last time, but one of the times it was done, was in the 1750s when an Irish-French economist named Cantillon was writing about wealth disparity. And he wrote basically, I'm going to paraphrase, but he said, if you're close to the king, when he creates a whole bunch of fiat money, not backed by anything, just creates it out of thin air, you can benefit from that. And the further you are from the king, the more you're hurt by the creation of all this money. That's known as the Cantillon effect. He who's closest to the king can profit from the creation of money. So if you live in Washington, D.C. or in New York on Wall Street or whatever, you've got ways to profit from the creation of this money. But the average person in Topeka, Kansas, or where I grew up near Tulsa, Oklahoma, those people, they're getting hurt by this. You're running faster, minimum wage is not keeping up. And so the solution that we come up with is, let's just increase the minimum wage. And you just it becomes a cycle of higher prices creates higher minimum wages, which creates higher prices and so forth. They're seeing this in California now. Bottom line is, Irish economist Cantillon was writing 20 years, 30 years before the French Revolution, where the people closest to the king, like Marie Antoinette, says, hey, the peasants have no bread. Now, I don't think she actually said this. That'd be debunked. Snopes would say that's not true, but somebody said it, and it's become a popular saying, the peasants have no bread. Well, let them eat cake. Just oblivious to the poverty, to the challenges, and so forth. Right now, Washington is almost oblivious. When you see the head of the Teamsters Union come to the Republican convention, and he didn't endorse Trump, but he said, hey, look, neither party has paid attention to us. The working man in America is getting screwed. The reason that they're getting screwed is not because of bad labor agreements. I would argue that it is because of unsound money. And I'll give you a point to this. In 1964, which was the last year that we put silver in our quarters, in 1964, the minimum wage in America was $1.25, 5 quarters. Well, the silver content of those 5 silver quarters today would be like $25 to $30, silver content alone. That would cover the minimum wage even in California, in any state in the union. Bottom line is it's not that we've not taken care of workers. It's we've given them unsound money, so they're constantly running behind. And we have this high inflation, high interest rates. They can never get ahead. High interest rates benefit those who have money, and they hurt those who don't have money. Mm-hmm. It is a lack of sound money. Inflation has created this Cantillon effect, which is one of my 5 undeniable truths.
So does the Fed see its job really as to flood the system with money? And how does that liquidity keep things moving and keep things afloat from really correcting as they should have many times since we've seen the excesses of this system?
The answer, all right, so if man has one tool and he sees all kinds of problems, and his tool's a hammer, so he sees everything as a nail. The Fed has one tool. They can essentially create money, and that's it. And you use the term flooding the system with money, and that echoes in my ears from Fed Chairman Powell, Fed Chairman Bernanke, Kashkari, Fed President from Minnesota. And there's a clip from 60 Minutes that I put on my show, Economic War Room, and play it in my program, which was our 300th episode. And it is, so the 60 Minutes guy is saying, so essentially you flooded the system with money. And he said, yes, flooding the system with money. They use that term like 3 or 4 times in that very short clip. Bottom line, that's what the Fed does every time they see a crisis. They flood the system with money, and they think that's helping people. What they're essentially doing, the old phrase of what is inflation, a Milton Friedman version of that is too much money chasing too few goods. That's the definition of inflation. So what do we do in COVID? We shut everything down. You can't go to work. You can't manufacture anything. You can't do that. And oh, by the way, the government's going to send you a check. We created more money and fewer goods, creating inflation. The Inflation Reduction Act was sending people money, and that sending people money under President Biden ran into inflation that's ran from 20 to 30% over a couple of years since it was passed. Bottom line is the Fed has been creating money. The federal government has been sending people money that has exacerbated the inflation because it's not real money. It's just fiat currency.
You know, Kevin, it's so crazy to think that this isn't just a US problem. You know, central banks around the world have taken on this role of flooding the system with money. Is that, you know, as a world, we're now over $400 trillion in debt, right?
Absolutely. And central banks around the world have followed the same formula. It is modern monetary theory that's being applied, but they're following the American lead because the US dollar is the reserve currency of the world, right? And so what happens is it's a different type of currency war. And it is, you want to debase your currency further and faster because that will expand your exports. So we have these two competitive things. Number one is I want my currency to be strong so I can buy and acquire and have power in the world. But at the same time, I also want my currency to be weak because that will help me to expand in foreign markets. Those two competitive forces generally would clash. They don't in America because of the reserve currency status. People still have to hold dollars to buy oil to do that trade. So we've had the exorbitant privilege that caused Charles de Gaulle from France to send a destroyer to New York, in the harbor of New York. A French military destroyer showed up and he said, I want my gold back in 1971. And Nixon said, you can't have it. And that's when we left the gold standard. So yes, it creates these unusual currencies. All the nations of the world have followed suit, but it started in America. And unfortunately, it's been our policy that's allowed them to do this. Now, it's a natural tendency of humankind to if I can borrow money cheaply, if I can be elite and benefit and profit from it. I mean, the whole Cantillon effect sounds evil to us working people. It's like, oh my gosh, you're putting us in a bad position. But it's like candy to the elite who have the opportunity to profit from it. And yes, it ends with the workers' revolt, which is a terrible solution, the Marxist system. It ends with critical theory where you're privileged and I'm not privileged and all this. It begins with unsound money. Mm-hmm. And that's the solution. It's not a communist solution. It's not a socialist solution. It is a fiscal responsibility, sound money solution.
Mm-hmm. Kevin, did the U.S. really have to export our dollars as well to avoid inflation domestically?
Well, we've done that, and absolutely we've exported, which starts as a Marshall Plan, or it starts as we're going to go in and we're breaking things, and the military goes and breaks things, destroys things, kills people. That's kind of a purpose of the military. We go into Iraq and we do all of those things, but we don't want to be the bad, evil one that's causing an uprising in the Middle East that's, inflames things. So we send pallets of money, literally pallets of money, and we've used that to not only further American foreign policy, make us look like the good guys. We send money around the world, and we do, but we send fiat money, taxpayer money around the world. We're also, as a nation, very generous, and people with their hard-earned money, individuals, they see a flood somewhere or a tsunami, or they see a terrible incident. America is very generous. around the world. But we use our money that way. But at the same time, because everybody has to buy dollars, it does buffer us from inflation. It's that exorbitant privilege idea that we create all this money, and yet we have not suffered the inflation to the same degree because people will buy it, hold it, buy our treasury bonds, and we don't have the massive interest rates that would come from it. Zimbabwe, not the reserve currency of the world, produces enormous amounts of money, and what happens? Their economy collapses. So they were producing in 1995 $100 Zimbabwe notes that were worth about $20 US, and 2008 they were producing $100 trillion Zimbabwe notes that weren't worth 1 penny US. Interest rates were off the charts. So we've benefited from having the reserve currency, and because we've sent our dollar overseas, so to speak, and it's used for oil transactions and so forth, we have not suffered the inflation that we will likely suffer if we lose the reserve status.
Yeah, in a way, when those dollars come home, when there's less demand around the world for them, that is going to produce enormous inflation again, right?
Right, because they're not holding them in their banks and in their electronically, they're not holding them as in dollars or in government bond, U.S. government bonds. They're actually then going to be, well, what good is this? I've got to spend it as rapidly as I can, which is what happens in hyperinflations. For example, if you're in Argentina, I'm going to be interviewing a whistleblower next week who worked at Bank for International Settlements that's creating a central bank digital currency. But he said, I grew up in Argentina, and when the currency was collapsing, my dad would rush home with his check, deposit it in the bank, get the cash out, and run to the grocery store as rapidly as he could to buy whatever I could. All of that money will be flooding in to buy whatever they can. Now, it may help the stock market. The best performing stock market in 2008 in the world, when the world's economy and stock markets were collapsing, was Zimbabwe. Because what can you buy when you get paid this money, your payday? I got to rush out and buy something. It takes several days to buy land. You can't buy gold immediately efficiently, but you can call your broker and say, buy me some stocks, and then you don't have to deliver the money for a couple of days. So you get the cash in hand, a couple of days, the stocks, you deliver that money's worthless in a couple of days, but you own the stocks and they're worth something. And it became a Ponzi scheme to where people just kept buying and kept buying and kept buying. So the U.S. stock market might actually do well in hyperinflation. John Templeton taught me that.
Nominally, right? not in real terms, but
not in real terms, but certainly better than the paper, the
Absolutely.
paper dollars. Yes.
Well, it's interesting. I was actually in Zimbabwe this past fall, and to see the destruction that corruption and inflation has caused is actually just unbelievable. But
this was Rhodesia, the breadbasket of Africa, one of the strongest economies. And then they made that decision that they were going down a Marxist path, as opposed to, let's look at Milei in Argentina, and they made the decision that he's going to go down more libertarian free market path. And you see the Argentinian economy recovering, interest rates coming down, inflation coming down. You're seeing all the benefits there of free market policies, where Zimbabwe or Venezuela or had gone the opposite direction. So yeah, free markets work, sound money works when it's tried, but then it gets very tempting because wealthy people can benefit if you go with unsound money.
So number 4, Kevin, is how governments intend to weaponize the currency. But this is more of a weaponization against its own citizens, right?
Yes, or against the U.S. dollar if you're foreigners. And absolutely, central bank digital currencies, which are being adopted by over 100 nations around the world, they see the handwriting on the wall. They see the recognition of the Great Reset, not a positive reset, but a great reset. All of this debt, 400 trillion or whatever, is going to come due at some point. And when it does, what do you do? And the answer is, hey, we saw this Bitcoin thing. It was really pretty cool. Bitcoin, everybody seemed to love it. The price went up, we love everything about it. The government say, except 2 things. 1, Bitcoin is private, and we don't want private. We want control. We want to see. And number 2, it's limited. So the 2 values of Bitcoin, only real values, really. I mean, it's way cool technology, don't get me wrong. But the two primary values of, you have some level of privacy and you have a limited number produced. And that's caused Bitcoin less than a penny to be $60,000 at some points. Governments see that and say, hey, we want to do exactly that, except take away the privacy and turn it into a control mechanism and make it limitless. If they do that, that is their fallback. If the dollar were collapsing, instead, we'll just make every American use central bank digital currency, and then we can control. If we need to, at the Federal Reserve level, speed up things and improve the economy, we'll put an expiration date on people's money. So it's digital money that could potentially have an expiration date. Or maybe we want to slow things down, so we'll put a good after date, like a coupon. Yeah, this is good after August 15th. And so we can slow spending down. And by the way, they're buying too much gasoline, and we don't like that's bad for the environment. So we'll let your money buy electricity to charge your car, but not buy gasoline. And this food is not good for you. We don't like that. And cigarettes aren't good for you. Or things like ammunition's not. And this isn't me as a conspiracy theorist. We play clips from the Bank for International Settlements where the guy says absolute control. We can control exactly who gets the money, where they use it, how they use it. Then you have someone from the World Economic Forum saying, yes, this will give us absolute control and it will allow us to pick what can be purchased and sold. And then you have someone from the IMF. We're so excited. The example, I've got my cup of coffee here. This is my second cup of coffee I'm drinking today, but someone from the G20 meeting came out and said, oh, we're so excited. We're talking about central bank digital currencies and the amount of control we can have. You know, I shouldn't drink too much coffee, but I love it and I drink a little too much coffee. So when I go to Starbucks in the afternoon, my money will know I've already had a cup in the morning and it will say, nope, you can only buy decaf coffee. I thought, that's crazy. But then I remember Mayor Bloomberg of New York City just 10 years ago was saying, hey, only 16 ounces of Coca-Cola. That's it. That's all we'll let you buy. Now they'll have a mechanism to control us down to the level of decision of what we eat for dinner. And they're excited about it, planning it, and it's ready to be implemented. If you think the currency is going to fail, the solution for the fiat currency that's failing because other nations are attacking it, or we have an inevitable amount, unsustainable debt. Well, what do? You just say, you can't buy or sell unless you use our central bank digital currency, and then we can control absolutely everything, and it won't matter what the interest rate is. We will have absolute control. That is the answer governments are putting into weaponizing against their own people, or there's a race to see, is the digital yuan going to be backed by gold? Is the BRICS countries going to have their currency that will be more useful than our currency? It's becoming a free-for-all. And that's the fourth undeniable truth, which lends to the fifth undeniable truth.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. So what is the fifth undeniable truth? Money
is changing. It's actually, money doesn't ever change, but currency changes. Real money is gold and silver, as we talked about earlier. Mm-hmm. But how I pay for things, whether I use my phone and tap to pay, or my watch and tap to pay, or I use Venmo or PayPal, or a cashless society to where you use a reverse ATM, you put your bills in and they give you a debit card out, or I have a chip implanted in my hand that I can pay with. Money is changing in multiple ways. Governments are accelerating that change, and it is inevitable that it's going to change. I run into people all the time who say, I don't want money to change. I'm like, sorry, it's too late. You can't. It is an undeniable truth. It's changing now. I don't carry a lot of bills in my wallet. There was a time when I would not go on a trip without $200 or $300 in my wallet, which is the equivalent of over $1,000 today. You know, I don't carry $1,000 in my wallet today. I tap to pay. I use Glint as a means of transaction, so I sometimes pay for things I buy and sell with gold. Mm-hmm. It's something out of the United Kingdom. My friend Jason Cousins created. I don't have any economic ownership in it, but I use it. I can go buy a bag of oranges at the local public supermarket and pay, and I pay in fractions of a gram of gold. And I keep my money in gold. Money is changing in many ways. It ought to be changing in a way that benefits people. the working class, the average person, not that benefits the elites. And so that's the argument of the book Pirate Money, is we believe that in the United States, that the states have a constitutional right to make gold and silver legal tender, and then adding modern technology, make it a useful monetary system that would not replace the Federal Reserve, but come alongside the Federal Reserve, just like I have tap to pay, or I can pay 15 ways when I go to, I can write a check, I can use tap to pay or whatever. So gold and silver made transactional with a debit card, a check, or physical transactions ought to be made available under the Constitution. The power is inherent. I have the court cases covered in the book Pirate Money that explains in detail how this can be stood up as a monetary system. I live in Texas, in the state of Texas, or Oklahoma, or Kansas, or Florida, or Alaska, or New Jersey. Every state in America has that constitutional right, and we have the technical capability now to have a monetary system that benefits people, it doesn't hurt people.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
That's pirate money.
You know, we've been speaking in this conversation and using the terms money and currency very interchangeably, but I love the distinction that Mike Maloney makes. As you said, money doesn't change. Currency is what changes. Fiat currency is what's changing and really results in all of these pernicious outcomes. Can the states make gold and silver coin legal tender today, Kevin?
They absolutely can, and several states have done it. A half dozen states have done that officially. Utah was among the first, and Utah produced silver rounds that were 1 ounce. At the time, you know, it might have been $12 for that 1 ounce silver coin. Now it's in the 20s. The problem is they didn't make them functional currency. Mm-hmm. So if I take that silver round into a retailer in Utah, I absolutely can spend it. It's complicated sometimes because the retailer, well, what do I do with this? But it is a 1 ounce coin. It's legal tender. I can go spend it there. The problem with it is I can't get like change. They can't give me a fraction of that silver coin back that I can go spend somewhere else. In the old days, a piece of 8 was 0.7734 troy ounces of silver. It's a Spanish milled dollar. The term milled refers to it was produced on a machine, so you couldn't just shave off pieces of it. But they'd cut it into 8 pieces, and those would trade as a bit, which was 12.5 cents. And you could go spend that. But there's no efficient way to spend that silver round from Utah today. And so the IRS looks at that and says, is it legal tender? Absolutely yes. Is it functional currency? No, not really. And so if I buy silver in a silver round from Utah and I pay $15 for it and sell it for $25, the IRS can knock on my door and say, hey, buddy, you owe us a capital gains tax. We want a third of that $10 that you made. Mm-hmm. And you have to pay it to them. Now, the IRS looks at Bitcoin and says, Bitcoin, is that functional currency? Yeah, actually, it could be. You could pay your employees with Bitcoin. You could pay for goods and services with Bitcoin. You can get change in Bitcoin. You know, it functions like a currency and you can use it. Is it legal tender? No, it's not legal tender. Therefore, it's taxable. And if you make money with your Bitcoin, you bought it at a penny and sold it at $60,000, you owe a buttload of tax. And the IRS knocks at your door and says, pay us that tax. Bottom line is, the IRS says, though, if it's both functional currency and legal tender, it is not subject to a capital gains tax. So states have made it legal tender. Our argument is, and we have 20 states that have entered legislation at various stages in the process to make it also functional currency by adding technology and making it entirely useful. I've got all the court cases that say the Supreme Court will stand down and say you can do this. But that should make it not taxable under the IRS code. And really, it's immoral to tax money. And I'll say that again, it is immoral to tax money. That's why poor people get hurt. If I got a dime in 1971, it should maintain its purchasing power. And by maintaining my purchasing power, putting it in silver instead of paper, I should not be taxed simply because my money kept its value. In In 1920s, you could get a Federal Reserve note that looks remarkably like our $20 bill today, or you could get a 1-ounce gold coin. That Federal Reserve note, if I go spend that today, it's worth $20. If I take that gold coin, it's kept its value. It's worth what, $2,475, depending on the minute that you're watching this, it will fluctuate, but it's over $2,400 as we're talking now. So Grandpa left me 10 of those pieces of paper or 10 gold coins. I want the gold coins. They've maintained their purchasing power. You could buy a nice man suit in 1924, 100 years ago, for $20. You walk into the best retailer in town, the top Saks Fifth Avenue. I can get a decent suit for $20. Today, that $2,400, you'll still buy me a decent man suit. It's just maintained its purchasing. That's why I don't think gold and silver are really investments. I think they're money. They maintain purchasing power. And I have 6,000 years of human history that backs me up.
Kevin, Well, I couldn't agree more, Kevin. And we've actually had a recent video pulled from YouTube for exactly saying this quote unquote medical misinformation. Even after submitting mainstream news evidence for our appeal was denied. So, there's this information complex that only sticks to one narrative. And exactly as you're saying, we should be scientific about this and always keep asking questions and look at the real data instead of the narrative that wants to keep being pushed.
Right. And the real data on vaccines.
Kevin, I want to be respectful of your time, but I wanted to get what some of your thoughts are towards solutions to the problem that our currency is facing right now.
Well, bottom line is it's the pirate money solution. If we return at the state level, it's constitutional. It cannot be interdicted by the Supreme Court or U.S. Bureau or Treasury Department, Federal Reserve. They can't suspend this. The court cases are very strongly with us. Individuals ought to be able to hold their money in the form of gold and silver, which is real money, and they ought to be able to spend it. And all it's going to take is simple legislation at the state level. More than half the states have entered legislation, including Texas and Florida and those that I mentioned. You can learn more at transactionalgold.com. We need to get this passed. And people will say, well, what can I do? I'm just one person. And so I'd like to share a very brief story from history, and I'm going to tell all of your audience that they are likely sufficient. If everyone in your audience would stand up and do what I'm going to suggest, we can have sound money again, and it will benefit all of us. And I'll give the example of 1940. We just see Winston Churchill installed as prime minister in the United Kingdom. He is a grouchy, grumpy, argumentative guy, but he sees Hitler as a threat. And so they go away from Neville Chamberlain, who was wanting to be pacifist, and go to Churchill. And Churchill says, this is what we're going to do. And they say, I'm sorry, Mr. Prime Minister, the entirety of the British Expeditionary Force is trapped on a small French beach town called Dunkirk, and they're going to get wiped out. Mm-hmm. Wow. That's not good news. You're coming in as like the Hitler's surrounding with Panzer tanks. But what he called is Operation Dynamo, and Operation Dynamo joined with the British Navy, which could not get into the shallow water. Dunkirk's a beach town. You walk out into the beach. It is not designed for big destroyers and the British Navy to come in and get the men off the beach. So what they had to do was Operation Dynamo. They had to call for every sailor every pleasure craft, every sailboat, every speedboat, fishing trawlers. Come help us. And they lined up. They were called the little ships or the small ships, and it's the miracle of Dunkirk. And they took the 26-mile jaunt from Dover to Dunkirk and back, and they brought the men back. Those were the little ships. They had their role to do. My suggestion for your audience and everyone I talk to is get a copy of the book Pirate Money and read. Your role is to help us get this transactional gold and silver put into the legislature, encourage them to pass it, and we will have a solution for the Great Reset, for central bank digital currencies, for the potential inflation coming, for the potential collapse of the dollar. It's a way that you can preserve, protect, and defend your money. And all we need to do is work together to get that done. It doesn't require a big government. It's a smaller government, a state government. And you know your state legislator or your state senator. I will tell you, I work with these guys. If they get a call from someone that's a constituent, said, hey, I want you to read this book. In fact, I'm going to send you a copy and mail it to them. That impacts them. If they get 10 copies, the lieutenant governor of Texas was talking to a friend of mine. He came in and asked for a donation in his office, and my friend pulls out a copy of the book Pirate Money and hands it to Dan Patrick and says, Lieutenant Governor, would you please do this in Texas in the Senate? He said, he laughed and he said, oh, I know, Kevin. I've gotten 10 copies of that book. Absolutely, we're going to do this. We're looking at this. We want to take care of the people of Texas. It's the small ships that will make the difference. You know, if 10 people sent in to President Biden or Trump something and ask him to do it, it's not going to have any impact. 10 people send their state legislator or state senator a book and tell them to do this, they're going to really listen and pay attention. And that's what your audience can do to help me. In the meantime, do what I do. Buy some gold and silver, put some money with Glent, or wherever you buy gold and silver. You know, I'm not sponsored by any gold dealer or silver dealer, but put some money in sound money and don't just bury it. Find a way to spend it. I'm a Christian. And there is a parable called the parable of the talents where Jesus tells about the master comes along, he gives 3 servants, 3 different amounts of money. And then one goes out and invests it and brings back a profit. He says, well done. Another goes out and invests it, brings back a profit. Well done. The third one says, well, I was scared, so I buried it in the backyard. Well, what happens there? You bury it in the backyard. Bottom line is you take the money out of circulation. Warren Buffett said it this way: if all the money in the world was put in gold and we mined it from South Africa, flew it on a plane here, refined it and put it in a safe, the economy would collapse. We can't just put everything we own in the ground. We got to make it transactional. So gold and silver are fantastic. Let's find a way to make them transactional, and that's the whole point of pirate money. You can do it at a personal level. You'll have to pay tax when you do it today, or we can band together like Operation Dynamo and the small ships, and we can make it possible for us to have transactional gold and silver for everybody where you're not stuck with the tax, and we can literally avoid the Great Reset and all the problems associated. So that's what people should do to protect their money. Get a copy of the book Pirate Money and read it, or watch my show Economic War Room, which is on Blaze TV, or listen to Pirate Money Radio either as a podcast or on American Family Radio every Saturday morning, 10 a.m. Central.
I love that idea of, sending, let's say, your state senator a copy of the book, because again, if this is an educational problem, which for most people it is, that also includes state senators, because at the end of the day, they're just people. They don't know everything, and they don't know, let's say, the best or the most important information at this time to understand about the problems with our currency and the amazing solution that is money, real money.
Yep. And in fact, if a senator gets a copy of Pirate Money, it will go on his shelf or her shelf. If he gets a second copy, the second one will be given away and the first one will remain on the shelf. By the fourth copy, I've got to read this. And they won't read it otherwise. Very rarely would they read it. I mean, we tried to make it catchy. I put cover notes from, Dr. Ben Carson wrote one of the notes, and Nick Vujicic, a man without arms and legs, wrote the foreword, and Senator Jim DeMay. I tried to put Naomi Wolf, famous people that have read it and wrote endorsements for it on there to encourage them. But really, it's going to take 3, 4, 5 copies, and then at that point, it's like, okay, I have to read it. Why do people keep sending it? And those are the small ships. That's how we win one senator or representative at a time. And if we do that, we can wake up in the year 2030 where the poor people aren't disadvantaged to the rich, where everybody has an equal opportunity. I believe not in equity, I believe in equality, but we don't have equality when we don't have sound money.
So for anybody that's interested in getting a copy of the book, that's piratemoneybook.com, available everywhere. Of course, your other website, economicwarroom.com, and like you said, your podcast, piratemoneyradio.com. You're also available on Twitter at Secret Weapon USA. Kevin, I want to thank you so much for your time today and helping explain this to everybody in an approachable, digestible manner.
Thank you, Tom. God bless you.
This podcast is for general informational purposes only. Nothing on this podcast should be taken as investment advice. Guests on this show are not compensated for their appearance. Listeners are urged to educate themselves and make their own decisions. Do not base any investment decisions on the information contained. To view our full disclaimer, please visit our website.